morning, everyone. So you are done with all of your work for history for the year from our books. You just took your test on the 13 colonies yesterday. So over the next 2 days, we're just going to hear a little bit from Story of the World about the aftermath of the founding of these colonies. Today, we're going to read a little story that talks about, actually, the title of it is 3 Pointless Wars. 3 wars fought over the land of North America, but you're going to hear also about some other things happening at this time and get into also the 7 Years' War. So let's start reading from Story of the World. Now, in the story right before this, it was talking about China. It said China's empire was the largest in the world at this time. But the countries that had to pay tribute to China were constantly hoping to be free. Chinese soldiers were always fighting to keep Mongolia, Turkestan, Taiwan, and other Chinese protectorates loyal. Now, the empires of France, England, and Spain were no more peaceful. But instead of fighting to keep their colonies, these 3 empires, so close together in Europe, fought with each other. Now, these 3 countries fought 3 wars. France, England, and Spain were fighting 3 different wars. Each one of these wars started over in Europe and then spread to the colonies in North America. Each war had 2 names, one that was used by the Europeans and another used by the colonists. And none of these 3 wars accomplished anything other than people dying from it. Now, the first war was started when Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King of France, tried to expand France's power in Europe. The other countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, the German state of Austria, and England, they banded together in an alliance to stop France from expanding. They called their war the War of the Grand Alliance. While English soldiers fought against the French in Europe, the English government also paid the Iroquois of North America to attack French settlements in Canada. So, in response, the French settlers who knew perfectly well that the English were behind these Iroquois attacks. So it was the Native Americans attacking the French settlements, but the English were the ones who really were the reason for it. They started attacking English settlements, the French did. For 8 years, English settlers in New York and New England fought against French settlers in New England and Canada. The settlers called their war, the North American part of the War of the Grand Alliance, they called it King William's War, after King William of England at the time. Now, after 8 years of fighting this war, which had 2 different names, neither side actually won. But over in Europe, France and England finally made peace with each other. The settlers were ordered to stop fighting, so they did. 8 years of fighting from 1689 to 1697 had given the French and English colonies nothing except hatred for each other. 4 years later, Louis XIV managed to make his grandson King of Spain, which gave him more power than ever. England and the Netherlands declared war on France again, and this time on Spain as well. This war of Spanish succession went on for years and years in Europe. Once more, the French and English colonists in North America fought with each other, just as their parent countries in Europe were doing. They called their war Queen Anne's War, after the new Queen of England. William and Mary had died, and Mary's little sister Anne had inherited the throne. Now, during Queen Anne's War, the English managed to capture several French settlements. The French settlement of Acadia, east of Quebec, now belonged to the English. And English troops marched down into Florida and burned the Spanish colony of Pensacola. England seemed to be gaining the upper hand in North America. But once again, the war ended without any real victory. Over in Europe, the English and French made peace after 13 years of fighting. Once more, the French, English, and Spanish colonists stopped fighting for now. Now, for a little while, France and England were at peace. Both countries had new rulers. 2 years after the end of the War of Spanish Succession, Louis XIV died. His 5-year-old great-grandson inherited the throne. England's Queen Anne died too without an heir. She didn't have any children to take over. So Parliament voted to pass the crown to the great-grandson of James I, who is called the Bible King. This great-grandson was named George Louis, and he was a good George Louis, and he was a good Protestant prince. Unfortunately, he wasn't English. George's mother, who was James's granddaughter, had been born in Germany and had grown up to marry a German prince. Now, George Louis grew up in Hanover, speaking only German and thinking of himself as basically German. But Parliament was so anxious to avoid having a Catholic king that they were willing to crown a German as their king. So at certain times in history, it was more important what religion they were, and others it was their nationality, and so they were okay with the German as long as he wasn't Catholic. So George Louis arrived in England and was crowned George I of England. So they had to do all of England's business in French. So England and France were at peace while George I and Louis XV reigned. So were the English and French colonies in North America. But after George I died of a stroke and his son George II inherited the throne, war broke out for the third time. This time the war was between England and Spain, not England and France. And it started over an ear. Spanish and English sea captains had never been good friends. English ships often prowled the waters between South America and Spain, hoping to catch Spanish galleys carrying gold from the South African mines and rob them. Spanish sea captains suspected all English of being pirates. There were some actual pirates, but they suspected everybody. Spanish ships guarded the waters near South American ports, searching and sometimes robbing English merchants who were following the law even. Now, one gray fall day, a sea captain named Robert Jenkins stalked into a meeting of Parliament, a jar in his hand. Members of the House of Commons, meeting together to discuss the Spanish harassment of English ships, watched him walk to the wooden table at the center of the room. Jenkins pulled his long grizzled hair back behind his ear. One ear was pierced with a gold hoop, and the other ear was gone. Jenkins slapped the jar down on the table. His ear floated in it, pickled in a pint of whiskey. "You see this?" Jenkins shouted. "The Spanish boarded me off the coast. Came aboard, tied us up, accused us of being pirates. Me, just a law-abiding English merchant. And when they couldn't find no stolen golds, their captain sliced off my ear." And then he yelled, "Were the King of England here, I would do the same for him." Then they robbed our ship, climbed back aboard their own, and set us adrift without oars or sails. So it was all because of an ear, but it was because the Spanish had been starting to accuse all of the English as pirates and punishing the ones even if they were innocent merchants. Now, Parliament was furious at this treatment of a law-abiding English merchant. The Spanish pointed out that Robert Jenkins was actually a thief and a liar, and that none of this had ever happened, but no one listened. In 1739, England declared war on Spain. Now, this was called the War of Jenkins Ear. That was the name of it. And soon it grew much bigger, or that was one name for it. Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, had just died, and his heirs were fighting about who would inherit his power. The English supported the Austrian heir. France didn't want Austria to have any more power. So France joined Spain in its war against England. Then Austria joined England, and Prussia joined France. The War of Jenkins Ear had turned into the War of Austrian Succession. Once more, Europe was at war. And once more, the war trickled over into the colonies. The English colonists in Georgia marched down and attacked the Spanish colonies in Florida. Up north, the French and English colonists started fighting with each other. Once more, the colonists gave their war the name of the English king, King George's War. The fighting went on for 4 years. Now, finally, England, France, and Spain all signed a peace treaty and told the colonists to stop fighting again. The third pointless war had ended. Hundreds of colonists and Native Americans had died in King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. But nothing had actually changed. That's why they were called 3 pointless wars. Okay, let's hear now about the 7-Year War. Now, after 3 wars, France, England, and Spain were no closer to settling their fight over North America. France had colonies far north in Canada and far south where the state of Louisiana now lies. England had colonies all along the eastern coast. Those are the ones we've been learning about. And Spain had colonies in Florida and in Santa Fe, New Mexico on the other side of the country. But huge areas of North America still lay open, like Arkansas. Which country would drive the others out and win over the whole continent is what the question was. One more war would settle the question once and for all. This time, the war started in North America and then spread throughout the rest of the world. In 1753, 5 years after the end of King George's War, the governor of the English colony of Virginia heard alarming news from English scouts. The French were building roads into the Ohio Valley, which is today western Pennsylvania. Now, the governor, Robert Dinwiddie, knew that England wanted the rich timbered Ohio River Valley too. If the French claimed the valley, the English might never get their hands on it. So Governor Dinwiddie sent a message to King George II. Said, what should we do? They're encroaching on this area. King George II sent an answer back. Send a messenger and tell the French to leave. If they won't, go chase them out and build an English fort to protect the land. Governor Dinwiddie sighed. He had very few fighting men left, certainly not enough to take on all of France. Who would be willing to travel through hundreds of miles of wilderness, risking capture, carrying a letter, telling the French to retreat? Any guesses? Now, one young Virginian volunteered. George Washington, only 21 years old. He had been born in Virginia to an English tobacco farmer. He had spent the last few years working as a surveyor, measuring farms and drawing up maps for their owners. But George Washington wanted to be a soldier, not a surveyor. He begged Governor Dinwiddie for permission to carry the message. So on Halloween, the governor agreed. Washington found a wilderness guide and a translator to accompany him, and he set off that same day, not even waiting until morning. It took 3 weeks for the little party to ride through the mountains, up through the Ohio River Valley, and to the headquarters of the French. When he was just days away, Washington found himself at the richest place in the whole valley, the Ohio Fork, where 3 rivers joined together. Washington thought to himself, a fort built here could command the whole valley. And he's right. He traveled on, finally reaching the French headquarters north of the valley. When he gave the French commander the governor's message, the commander simply laughed and told the young man to go back to Virginia. Washington set off. By now is the middle of December, snowing and getting colder every minute. His little party was running out of food. Their horses were starving and so weak that Washington finally just left them behind. As he trudged through the snow with his wilderness guide, a Native American ally of the French leapt out and shot at him. Washington was afraid that the French had regretted letting him go and had sent assassins after him. He hurried onto the shores of the Allegheny River. Not sure about the pronunciation actually there. He had to get across right away, but the river was filled with rolling cakes of ice. Washington and his guide built a raft and launched it out into the river. Ice slammed against it, overturning it. Washington fell, clutching for the raft's edge. He barely caught it and hauled himself back up, dripping. The guide still clung to the raft. The 2 men came aground on a little island at the middle of the river, and there they spent the night with no fire, no food. The temperature dropped more and more. Ice rattled down on them. Washington's clothes froze solid. But in the morning, the river was a sheet of thick ice. The two men walked across it to the opposite shore. They could just walk now. Finally, they reached a settlement where English traders lived, and they managed to get fresh horses for the ride home. Now, when Washington arrived back at Governor Dinwiddie's place in Williamsburg, he told the governor about the French refusal. Dinwiddie sent a message to England asking for more soldiers. Meanwhile, 40 men were sent to build a fort at the place where those three rivers met. Dinwiddie promoted Washington to a higher rank and sent him to protect the new little fort along with a small band of colonial soldiers. But the French were already too strong. They took away the little fort and defeated Washington's tiny army. Washington surrendered, and he was forced to retreat. And actually, they allowed him to retreat rather than keeping him captive. Now, the English weren't about to give up, though. 2,000 English regular soldiers arrived from London. So they're not just using colonists, they're bringing them over from England now, getting involved in this. Under the command of an English general named Edward Braddock. Now, Edward Braddock was sure that his regular and disciplined troops would quickly beat off the French and their Native American allies. He invited George Washington to come along with him as his aide to see the English victory. But Braddock had no idea how to fight in the rough woods and mountains of North America. He marched his men toward the Ohio River Valley in a long line, beating drums and waving banners, blasting rocks out of the way. The French were ready. They could hear him coming. They ambushed Braddock's soldiers from behind trees, just 10 miles away from the Ohio Fork. The soldiers' red uniform coats actually made them really easy targets. And when the English soldiers tried to hide and shoot from behind the trees, Braddock ordered them back into line. 1,000 English soldiers fell, and the rest ran away in terror. That's a disaster. Now, Washington himself had 2 horses shot out from underneath him. When he undressed that night, he found 4 bullet holes through his clothing, but he lived through it. This was the French and Indian War, and it says that this was really the start of it. Now, soon other countries in Europe chose sides and joined in. The war spread across Europe, even into India, and across the oceans of the world. The French and Indian War was given a new European name, the 7 Years' War. So French and Indian War in the States, and by Indian, they're talking there about the Native Americans, and they were saying the country of India actually was joining in on it. But it was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Now, at first, France seemed to be gaining the upper hand, but the Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, was determined that England would triumph. He made sure that the English troops in North America had plenty of money, ships, and ammunition, and that the colonial soldiers and the regulars from England fought together, rather than bickering with each other. And the English redcoats began to figure out how to fight in the woods and fields of North America. Now, they took off their red coats, turned them inside out, and covered the insides with clay. Very smart. They rubbed soot and dirt on their shiny ship-shaped gun barrels so that they wouldn't glint in the sun. Then they started fighting in small groups from behind trees. They're figuring out how to make it work in North America. Now, the Indian allies of the French were disgusted. Those redcoats, they told the French, no longer stand still and let us kill them. Of course, they don't just stand still and let them kill. But that's what apparently they thought of them being at first. They just stood there and waited for a bullet to come to them. Now, the French were having troubles at home, too. Now, Louis XV had grown up into a weak and wasteful man. He was not a strong king. He spent most of his time chasing women and wallowing in luxury, and becoming more and more unpopular in his country. In 1757, 3 years after the war began, an assassin sneaked into the royal palace of Versailles and tried to kill him with a pocket knife. Soon, the English were driving the French out of North America. George Washington led a successful attack on the Ohio River fort and won it back for England. It was renamed Fort Pitt after the Prime Minister. Today, the city of Pittsburgh stands where that fort was first built. That's cool. Then the English conquered Quebec, the capital of New France. The next year, Montreal fell to England as well. New France belonged to England, that whole region in Canada. the French agreed to a surrender. So in 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War. Louis XV agreed to give up all of France's lands in North America, except for the territory called Louisiana. Now, many settlers in New France moved back to France, or they went down to New Orleans in the Louisiana colony. Some stayed, still speaking France, but now under British rule. In New France, they're talking about. There were some French people that stayed there, but they had to go along with British rule. Now, Louis XV had lost the huge empire that Louis XIV had saved. His people hated him for it. When he died of smallpox not long after this, his courtiers poured quicklime on his body and buried him at night with no ceremony. He was a king that was not given a proper burial because all of the Frenchmen, just French people, were ashamed of him and angry that he lost out on so much land. He had become the most unpopular person in all of France. Okay, very interesting stories about those wars. So I enjoyed that. I hope you guys did too. Tomorrow we'll read another one on discontent in the British colonies, moving on from the fighting between England and Spain and France to fighting between the colonies and England. So we'll get into that tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoy. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.